Hollywood has always sold us an image of toughness. Chiseled jaws, steely eyes, men who throw a punch on screen and make the entire audience flinch. But here's the thing about manufactured toughness. It crumbles the moment you dig beneath the surface. Most of what you see on a movie screen is craft, illusion, carefully choreographed movements performed by trained stunt doubles while the star watches from a folding chair just off camera. But then there are the exceptions. There have been men, a rare and extraordinary few, who walked onto a Hollywood set already forged by something far more brutal than any director could dream up. Men who had already survived war, poverty, crime, and catastrophe before the cameras ever rolled. Men for whom playing a tough guy wasn't a stretch of imagination. It was simply Tuesday. Today we are going to count down the 10 most legitimately tough actors in the history of Hollywood cinema. Not the toughest characters. Not the most convincing performers. The actual toughest human beings who ever stood in front of a camera and delivered a line. We will look at their real backgrounds, their actual records, and the moments that proved beyond any doubt that what you saw on screen was not the performance. It was a preview, and when we get to number 4, I promise you, even if you think you know your classic Hollywood history, your jaw is going to drop. Let's begin. Charlton Heston is remembered today primarily for two things: the epic biblical and historical films that made him one of the biggest stars of the 1950s and 1960s, and his later career as a political activist. But what most people overlook is that before Heston ever swung a sword or cracked a chariot whip on film, he had already proven his physical courage in the skies over the Pacific. During World War II, Heston enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces and served as a radio operator and gunner on B-25 Mitchell bombers flying missions in the Aleutian Islands Theater of the Pacific. He rose to the rank of Staff Sergeant and completed his service with an honorable discharge in 1946. He rarely spoke in grandiose terms about his military service, but those who knew him understood that his years in uniform had wired into him a fundamental comfort with danger and discomfort that most people never develop. That comfort showed up again and again on his movie sets. For the 10 Commandments in 1956, Heston insisted on filming in the actual Sinai Desert, enduring temperatures that drove multiple crew members to seek medical treatment for heat exhaustion and dehydration. He worked through it without complaint. For Ben-Hur in 1959, the preparation alone would have broken most men. Heston trained for months learning the extraordinarily difficult skill of driving a Roman chariot, not a skill that translates easily from a modern life. He suffered repeated injuries during rehearsals and still insisted on performing the vast majority of the famous chariot race himself. The stunt coordinator on the film documented the specific moment when Heston's chariot nearly overturned during a jump, a moment that could easily have ended his career. Or worse. He got back in the seat. Director William Wyler, a man not known for ease of praise, reportedly said of Heston during production that his physical courage was simply remarkable for a man of his stature and salary. That assessment speaks for itself. But perhaps the most quietly impressive demonstration of Heston's authentic endurance came during El Cid in 1961. Heston spent full shooting days, sometimes exceeding 10 hours, wearing suits of full-plate armor in the Spanish summer heat. His co-star Sophia Loren, who worked with him on production, later recalled that while other actors could barely tolerate the armor for a brief period between takes, Heston wore it all day without requesting relief or adjustment. She described it as something almost beyond normal human endurance. She was right. Anthony Quinn arrived in Hollywood having already lived several lives' worth of hardship. Born in Chihuahua, Mexico, in 1915 during the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, Quinn's earliest years were defined by violence, displacement, and grinding poverty. His family eventually settled in East Los Angeles, where Quinn spent his youth working manual labor jobs before he was old enough to hold most of them legally. Before he was an actor, Quinn was a boxer. Not a theatrical boxer, a working professional fighter who stepped into rings as a teenager to generate income for his struggling family. The distinctive broken nose that became one of his most recognizable features was not a Hollywood prop. He earned it the hard way. That same time in the ring gave him a functional and real understanding of physical violence, of pain management, and of what it actually means to endure punishment without showing it. Quinn also worked as a butcher's assistant, a laborer in construction, and numerous other physically demanding jobs that built the powerful frame he would later carry so convincingly in films like Zorba the Greek and Lawrence of Arabia. When Quinn picked up a heavy object on screen, he knew how to carry it because he had spent years carrying things for money. During the filming of Zorba the Greek in 1964, a sequence required Quinn to move logs that would ordinarily require two men. Rather than call for mechanical assistance or a stunt double, Quinn simply performed the feat as written. The Greek laborers working as extras on the film were reportedly impressed. Coming from men who perform that kind of physical labor daily, that reaction means something. Director Elia Kazan, who worked with Quinn on Viva Zapata in 1952, observed that what made Quinn different from other physically imposing actors was the authenticity behind the power. It wasn't cultivated in a gym for a role. It was a residue of a hard life, and it showed in every frame. Robert Mitchum is one of the great enigmas of classic Hollywood, a man of obvious intelligence and artistic sensitivity who spent most of his career playing men who operated in moral shadows, and who brought to those roles an authenticity that puzzled directors for decades. The reason for that authenticity is not complicated once you know his history. Mitchum was effectively orphaned in early childhood after his father died in a railroad accident. By his early teens, he was riding freight trains across Depression-era America, finding work wherever he could, ditch digging, coal mining, and eventually professional boxing under the name Jimmy Mitchum. His boxing career was brief and never made him wealthy, but it gave him something more durable: a broken nose, a natural physical economy, and the calm disposition of a man who has already absorbed more punishment than most people face in a lifetime. The experience that most shaped Mitchum's authentic screen presence, however, was something he rarely discussed at length. As a teenager, after being arrested for vagrancy in Georgia, Mitchum was placed on a chain gang. He served weeks doing hard labor under brutal conditions before managing to escape. That experience gave him a first-hand understanding of the criminal justice system, of coercion and survival, and of the kind of men who populate the darker corners of American life. When he played those men on screen, he wasn't imagining them. He recognized them. His 1948 arrest for marijuana possession, at a time when such a charge could permanently destroy a career, only deepened his mystique. Rather than collapse under the scandal or beg the public for forgiveness, Mitchum served his 60 days in a Los Angeles county jail with the same imperturbable calm that defined his screen performances. He came out the other side with his reputation not damaged but burnished. His co-workers consistently noted something about Mitchum that is hard to put into words but impossible to ignore on screen. There was a latent physical capability to him, a sense that this was a man who, if circumstances required it, could handle himself in ways most people couldn't. Director Otto Preminger, who worked with Mitchum on River of No Return, described him as possessing a genuine and slightly unsettling presence that no amount of acting training could replicate. You either had it or you didn't. Mitchum had it. Before he was Duke Wayne, he was Marion Morrison, a large, physically powerful young man from Iowa and California who earned a football scholarship to the University of Southern California, and who spent his early days in Hollywood not as an actor but as a prop man and part-time stuntman, moving set equipment that took multiple other men to handle. Wayne's physical scale was genuine and substantial. Standing 6 feet 4 inches and powerfully built even in youth, he combined size with a kind of functional physical toughness that comes from actual labor rather than performance. The roles he played in his long career, frontier lawmen, military officers, working-class heroes, were not an enormous stretch. He had the body and the bearing for them because he had spent years doing physical work. What elevated Wayne into this list, however, is not simply his size. It is his documented pain tolerance and his refusal to let injury stop him. When he cracked ribs during the filming of The Alamo in 1960, a film he was also directing, he had them taped, continued directing, and continued appearing on screen. He simply didn't stop. More remarkable still is what happened after his lung cancer surgery in 1964. Wayne had a lung and several ribs removed. His doctors told him plainly that his recovery would be long, and that returning to physically demanding film work was not a no-term possibility. Wayne began performing his own stunts again within months of the surgery for the Sons of Katie Elder. Director Henry Hathaway reportedly tried on multiple occasions to convince Wayne to use a double for the more dangerous sequences, and was flatly refused. Wayne's position, by all accounts, was consistent and simple. If he needed a double, they could hire a different actor. That is a particular kind of stubbornness that is indistinguishable from genuine toughness. His exposure on the set of The Conqueror in 1956, filmed downwind of nuclear test sites in Utah, eventually contributed to his death from stomach cancer in 1979. Even that grim reality speaks to something. A man who, in the years between that exposure and his death, performed some of the most physically demanding work of his career without knowing what was slowly accumulating in his body. Don't mistake James Cagney's 5 feet 5 inch frame for a soft target. The man who became synonymous with a Hollywood gangster grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan at a time when that neighborhood was one of the most genuinely dangerous environments in American urban life. He did not emerge from it unscathed, and he did not emerge from it unable to handle himself. Cagney learned to box as a practical skill, not a hobby. In the environment where he grew up, physical capability was a form of currency. Being small and living in that world required either developing speed and skill or accepting the consequences of neither, and Cagney chose speed and skill. He became an accomplished amateur boxer with legitimate technical ability, fast hands, economical footwork, the ability to generate real power from a compact frame. What most audiences didn't fully appreciate when watching Cagney's famously convincing fight scenes was that the realism was not simply acting. Cagney had been in real street confrontations. He understood the geometry of violence, not the theatrical, drawn-out, back-and-forth variety that movies typically depicted, but the swift, brutal, conclusive kind that actually happens when men who know how to fight come into contact on a sidewalk. His screen fights looked different from other actors' screen fights because they were modeled on real experience rather than choreographic convention. Director Raoul Walsh, who directed Cagney in several films including White Heat, spoke about this quality directly. Cagney threw punches differently than other actors because his muscle memory had been trained by real punching. There was technique behind it that didn't need to be invented from scratch for each production. Cagney was also a trained dancer before he was an actor, a point that sounds incongruous until you understand that elite physical coordination and explosive power are not opposites. They are relatives. His dancing gave him extraordinary body awareness and control, which translated directly into his ability to move convincingly in fight sequences well into his later career. His reputation off the set was equally formidable. He was not a man who invited provocation, and the people who worked around him understood that. Bob Hope once remarked that Cagney was the sort of man who would put you on the ground without particular drama and then help you back up, a description that captures both his capability and his character with remarkable efficiency. Born as Danilovich in Amsterdam, New York, the son of illiterate Jewish immigrants who had fled Russia, Kirk Douglas grew up in a poverty so complete that food was not always available. He sold snacks to mill workers as a child, turned every available opportunity into a transaction, and developed through sheer grinding necessity the determination that would eventually carry him from the tenements of upstate New York to the top of the Hollywood hierarchy. But Douglas was not only hustling for money, he was also competing. Before he became an actor, Douglas was a legitimate collegiate wrestler, good enough to earn a scholarship to St. Lawrence University on the strength of his ability on the mat. This was not show wrestling. It was genuine competitive athletics requiring strength, technical skill, and the willingness to be hurt. Douglas had all three. His service in the United States Navy during World War II added another layer. Commissioned as a communications officer aboard a submarine chaser involved in anti-submarine warfare operations, Douglas experienced one of the more psychologically demanding forms of naval service. Small vessels, constant threat, confined spaces, and a particular strain of knowing that a submarine you cannot see may already have you in its sights. He received a medical discharge after being injured during a depth-charge detonation that shook his vessel. What separated Douglas from other tough actors was not just physical toughness, but what might best be described as, the absolute, implacable refusal to accept defeat or limitation. Director Stanley Kubrick, who notoriously clashed with Douglas during the production of Spartacus in 1960, reportedly acknowledged afterward that Douglas was simply a force of nature. Kubrick was not a man who complimented people easily. His description of Douglas's mental toughness as genuinely intimidating carries considerable weight. Douglas survived a severe helicopter crash in 1991 that killed 2 other people and inflicted serious back injuries on him. He was in his 70s. He rehabilitated. He walked again. Then, in 1996, he suffered a debilitating stroke that severely impaired his speech. He underwent years of intensive therapy, regained significant function, and published a book about the experience. He continued working. The pattern is consistent from childhood to old age. Douglas met every obstacle the same way, with the same fundamental response, which was to keep going. Here is where we need to pause, because Steve McQueen's story is one that studio publicists actively worked to obscure during his lifetime. The truth of who McQueen was and where he came from was considered too extreme, too difficult to reconcile with his carefully crafted image as Hollywood's king of cool. The shocking truth about Steve McQueen is not one thing. It is a pattern of authenticity so deep and so consistent that it reframes everything you thought you knew about him. McQueen's childhood was one of the most genuinely chaotic in this entire list. Abandoned by his father before he was born, sent to live with a great uncle in Missouri when his mother's instability made her incapable of caring for him, McQueen bounced between households and institutions throughout his early years. By his early teens, he was running with gangs in Los Angeles and had already accumulated a record of petty crimes. He was committed to the California Junior Boys Republic Reform School in Chino at age 14, not as a dramatic exaggeration, but as documented fact. He eventually enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1947, and his time in the Marines was characterized by precisely the combination of genuine capability and absolute contempt for authority that would define the rest of his life. He was reportedly demoted 7 times from the rank of private first class, a record of disciplinary infractions that is, by any measure, extraordinary. He spent time in the brig for extending an authorized leave. He was, by institutional standards, a nightmare, and yet, during an Arctic training exercise, McQueen's tank broke through ice into freezing water. McQueen pulled 5 fellow Marines to safety before the vehicle went under. The action was documented and contributed to an honorable discharge despite his disciplinary record. Whatever McQueen's relationship with rules, his relationship with genuine danger was uncomplicated. He moved toward it. His post-military path through odd jobs and into acting brought him eventually to the roles that made him famous. But here's what the studio system was terrified of audiences learning in the 1960s. McQueen was not playing at being a racing driver in Le Mans. He was a real one. He competed professionally under pseudonyms to prevent studios from voiding his insurance coverage. In the 1970 12 Hours of Sebring, one of the most demanding endurance races in the world, McQueen co-drove a Porsche 908 with Peter Revson and finished second overall, missing the overall victory by a margin of 23 seconds. He was racing with a cast on his leg from a motorcycle accident. Professional racing drivers who competed against him in that era have said consistently that he belonged on the track, not as a celebrity dilettante, but as a legitimate competitor. The studios were desperate to keep this out of public knowledge because they had spent enormous sums insuring McQueen's films. If audiences had understood how seriously he was racing, at Sebring, at the Badger 1000, in motorcycle competitions, the insurance apparatus that made his film financeable would have collapsed. So the information was suppressed, publicists were vague, and McQueen's racing career was systematically underreported for years. When McQueen was informed that he was on the Manson family's list of potential targets in 1969, a list that included Sharon Tate, who was murdered, he did not hire a security team. He began carrying a loaded .357 Magnum revolver and told the police that he would protect himself. Whether or not one approves of that response, it is a response of a man who had absolute confidence in his own capability and absolutely no interest in delegating his own safety to someone else. Stunt coordinator Bud Eakins, who doubled McQueen on the motorcycle fence jump in The Great Escape, knew McQueen better than almost anyone in the industry. His assessment was consistent over many decades. McQueen was not performing toughness. He was one of the few men in Hollywood who was genuinely what his image suggested he was, and the studios knew it and were sometimes more frightened by it than reassured. Lee Marvin was, before he was anything else, a United States Marine who saw some of the worst combat of World War II and came home carrying wounds that stayed with him for the rest of his life. ASA Private First Class with the 4th Marine Division. Marvin fought in the Battle of Saipan in June and July of 1944, one of the most brutal engagements in the entire Pacific campaign. Saipan was a grinding, close-quarters battle in tropical heat with extremely high casualty rates. Marvin was severely wounded by machine gun fire that severed his sciatic nerve. He was evacuated, spent nearly a year in naval hospitals recovering, and was medically discharged in 1945. He received the Purple Heart Medal. Of the 24 men in his platoon, only 6 survived the battle, though he almost never talked about it in the romantic terms that were common among veterans of his generation. When he did discuss his service, he was bracingly honest about what combat actually was: not glorious, not clean, not the thing that movies had made it. He understood violence from direct experience, and that understanding gave his screen portrayals of violent men an accuracy that other actors could not duplicate by any amount of craft. Director John Borman, who worked with Marvin on Point Blank in 1967, said that what made Marvin unique was that he understood violence not as a dramatic concept but as a physical and psychological reality. When Marvin was menacing on screen, the menace was credible because it was grounded in genuine experience, not fabricated for effect. His fellow actors felt it too. Men who were themselves tough and experienced, James Coburn, Ernest Borgnine, Telly Savalas, consistently described a shift in atmosphere when Marvin walked onto a set. There was a quality to him that the people around him could sense and could not entirely articulate, but that everyone agreed was real. Coburn, who was no one's idea of a soft man, said that Marvin's presence was simply different from other actors' presence, and that the difference was not something you could explain in technical terms. The bar fight in Oregon, documented by multiple witnesses from the production he was working on at the time, is perhaps the most frequently cited evidence of Marvin's off-screen capability. Well into his 40s, Marvin reportedly held his own in a confrontation with multiple significantly younger men until law enforcement arrived, appeared for work the following day on schedule despite visible injuries, and declined both medical attention and any adjustment to the shooting day. For Marvin, this appears to have been simply not a remarkable event. What made Marvin genuinely complex, and what elevates him above simple physical toughness, was the intellectual and emotional depth he brought to all of it. He was widely read, thoughtful about his craft, and capable of extraordinary sensitivity as a performer. He held the Medal of Honor recipients he met with profound reverence. The toughness was real. So was everything else. The face tells a story before a single word is spoken. That weathered, angular, suspicious, quietly dangerous face that made Charles Bronson one of the most recognizable men in cinema was not the product of makeup or lighting. It was a product of a childhood so hard that most people reading about it struggled to believe it actually happened in 20th century America. Born Charles Buchinski in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, in 1921, Bronson was the 11th of 15 children in a Lithuanian-American immigrant family. His father, a coal miner, died when Bronson was still a child, removing the household primary income and deepening a poverty that was already extreme. By the time he was 10 years old, Bronson was working in the coal mines himself. Not near the mines. In them. Underground. In the dark. Breathing coal dust. Doing the physical labor that adults did. Because a family needed him to that he spent formative years in conditions that permanently marked him, not psychologically in a soft sense, but physically and temperamentally. The squint that directors always noted, the way he held himself, the economy of movement, the absolute absence of anything that could be read as pretension, these were not affectations. They were the physical remnants of a childhood spent working in near darkness under conditions that would be illegal to impose on an adult today. When World War II came, Bronson served as an aerial gunner on B-29 Superfortress bombers flying missions over Japan with the Army Air Forces, earning a Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat. His military colleagues described him as exceptionally calm under fire, the kind of man whose composure in dangerous situations was not performed but simply present. After the war, Bronson worked over 50 different jobs before his acting career stabilized: onion picker, short order cook, truck driver, painter, professional boxer, building along the way the physical strength and practical knowledge of difficult work that would later make his performances so consistently convincing. When he played a labor or a fight on screen, he was drawing on a catalog of actual experience that spanned decades. Director Michael Winner, who worked with Bronson through multiple films including the Death Wish series, made a distinction that captures Bronson perfectly. Most actors playing tough guys are, Winner observed, naturally gentle people performing a role that requires them to seem dangerous. Bronson was the opposite, a genuinely hard man who happened also to be an actor. The performance was the surface. Underneath it was everything that life had actually made him. When the Mafia issued credible death threats against Bronson following the enormous success of Death Wish in 1974, the studio offered extensive protection arrangements. Bronson declined. His response, by multiple accounts, was essentially that he had been through enough in his life that the prospect of men threatening him didn't particularly register as something requiring external management. Given his actual history, that response is not bravado. It is proportion. There is no contest that if you want to identify the most legitimately, measurably, documentably tough man to ever appear in a Hollywood film, you need look no further than a baby-faced young Texan who stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed around 110 pounds when he enlisted, and was initially rejected by multiple branches of the United States military for being too small and too young. Audie Murphy went on to become the most decorated American combat soldier of World War. Murphy was born in 1925 in Kingston, Texas, into a desperately poor sharecropper family with 11 children. His father eventually abandoned the family, and Murphy helped care for his younger siblings while working farm labor as a child. When Pearl Harbor was attacked and he was of age to enlist, he tried the Marines, rejected for being underweight. He tried the Airborne, rejected again. The Army eventually took him. What followed over the next 2 years of combat service in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany constitutes one of the most extraordinary individual combat records in the history of American warfare. Murphy's decorations include a Medal of Honor, the highest award given by the United States government for military valor. He also received the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, 2 Bronze Star medals with valor, the French Legion d'Honneur, the French Croix de Guerre with Silver Star, the Belgian Croix de Guerre, and numerous other decorations. In total, he received 33 American and foreign awards and decorations by the time he was 21 years old. The action for which he received the Medal of Honor occurred on January 26, 1945, near Holtzwihr, France. Murphy's company was attacked by approximately 250 German soldiers supported by 6 tanks. As his men fell back, Murphy ordered them to withdraw and then, alone, climbed onto a burning M10 tank destroyer that was in imminent danger of exploding, manned its machine gun, and fought off a German advance single-handedly for an hour. He was wounded during the engagement. He was surrounded. He was out of ammunition for his rifle and using the weapons of the burning vehicle he was standing on. He held his position until reinforcements arrived and then led a counterattack. Military historians who have examined Murphy's full service record have estimated that he was personally responsible for killing somewhere between 240 and 300 enemy soldiers in combat. This is not a boast. It is a sober historical assessment of documented engagements. Many entire military units do not accumulate a record like that. When Murphy arrived in Hollywood after the war, his boyish appearance created an almost comic problem. Directors and studio security guards repeatedly had difficulty believing that this young, gentle-looking man was a war hero they'd been hearing about. He looked, by universal agreement, completely incapable of what the historical record showed he had done. That gap between appearance and reality defined Murphy's entire Hollywood career. He preferred comedy and light romance to action films. He was by most accounts shy, soft-spoken, and uncomfortable with the celebrity that his military reputation had conferred on him. He struggled profoundly with what we would today recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, sleeping with a loaded weapon and experiencing nightmares for the rest of his life. When he agreed to play himself in the 1955 autobiographical film To Hell and Back, based on his own memoir of the same name, something remarkable happened in the production process. The director and producers repeatedly had to soften and reduce Murphy's actual battlefield exploits because test audiences found them implausible. The real story was too extreme for fiction. Director Jesse Hibbs documented this directly. There were specific things Audie Murphy actually did that they could not put in a film about Audie Murphy because no audience would believe them. Read that sentence again, because it is one of the most remarkable statements ever made about any person in the history of Hollywood. Murphy suffered financial difficulties, personal struggles, and health problems in the years following his peak fame. He died in a small plane crash in Virginia in 1971, at the age of 45. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where his grave is one of the most visited in the cemetery, second only to that of President John F. Kennedy. He was not the biggest man on this list. He was not the most physically intimidating. He was not the most celebrated actor. He was something different and something rarer, a man whose real life was more extraordinary than any film character ever written, and who brought to every role he played the quiet, permanent weight of someone who had already seen and done things that most human beings cannot even imagine. That is not a character. That is not a performance. That is a man. Those are the 10 most legitimately tough men in the history of Hollywood cinema. Real toughness, earned toughness, the kind that no acting class teaches and no publicity machine manufactures. What unites all 10 of these men is not the roles they played. It's what they carried into those roles, the weight of actual experience. Poverty, combat, physical labor, real violence, real loss, real danger that wasn't scripted and couldn't be stopped by yelling cut. The next time you watch one of these men on screen, the next time you watch Mitchum's imperturbable cool, or Bronson's weathered stillness, or the young Audie Murphy quietly reenacting things he actually did, you'll know something about what you're looking at that goes beyond the movie. You're looking at the real thing. If you found this exploration valuable, hit the like button and subscribe. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these men's stories hit you hardest? Which one changed how you think about classic Hollywood? Drop it below.